Hey everyone, Kenan Proffitt here. In this video, we're going to take a look at this environment render that I did using Blender, and we're going to just kind of break it down and go through the different steps that I took to create this final image. So this isn't necessarily a full tutorial, but we're just going to kind of break down how I made this image and hopefully give some good tips along the way so that you can take kind of a more minimalistic approach to your renders, and how it doesn't take that much work to just grab a few assets, arrange them in a way where the composition looks nice, and you can get something that's really good for your demo reel or your portfolio. I do want to mention right off the bat here, if you're interested in sort of reverse engineering this whole scene file, I am making this available for download, so the link will be in the description. You can download and follow along. So the goal was to just create a nice African environment landscape. Jumping right into Blender here, you can see it looks far more complex than it really is. If you take out the elephants and the birds in the actual image, there's really only 5 or 6 assets here. Just a couple of grass clumps, the tree itself, which I made in Speed Tree and then exported to Blender. And then I broke off a branch of that to make a log to put in the foreground here. I knew I wanted something kind of interest in the foreground. And then these grass clumps I just had duplicated and scaled them in different positions, rotated them around to give some foreground interest. I also used a couple of particle systems on the foreground terrain to just instance the 2 grass clumps all over. And then I did some on the midground as well, just to add a little bit of contrast. And this is primarily just so they would catch light and add some more interest. I didn't want this to be a very foliage heavy scene, but it's important to have some grass in a render like this. And then of course you can see how messy this whole background is. The reason I duplicated so many terrains and went as far back as this, I could have just done an image or something, but I did use the mist pass in the render settings. So I wanted to get this nice mist layer that I could then use to further help the composition and draw the focus to my focal points here. So that ended up working out really nice by having so many of these, but you could certainly get away with just a much simpler backdrop. Now the initial focus of this image was of course this tree, and even in the final render that's definitely what you see and noticed first. A captivating render really tells a story in some way or another. I showed this image to one of my good friends from work, and he suggested the scene be backlit using a sunset silhouette. And then once that idea sort of clicked, everything just sort of started falling into place with the story of these elephants kind of traveling across this desert field. And you still get the nice tree as the main focal point, but then your eye quickly goes toward the elephants and the nice sunset. So these elephants I didn't model myself. They're from this user on BlendSwap, his sort of cartoon looking elephant. I did modify the geometry a bit. And then I just put a very simple elephant texture image on there, mixed in a little bit of roughness, and I did add bones to the trunk and to the body just to give it something where I can really work with and make some different interesting poses that work. So then I just appended that elephant that I had rigged up with my really sorry rig, and started kind of posing away to get some interesting little elephant poses, doing different elephant herd things. It was during this time that I actually spent about three months studying the behavior of these magnificent creatures in order to better know how to pose them. Yeah, no, I didn't do any of that. You can see if you actually opened up my blend file, the poses are complete cheats. They make no sense at all. I also did some shape keys with the ears, just created a couple shape keys where I can kind of pose the ears back and forth, and this would work well for a whole animation if I wanted these elephants to kind of be walking or just sort of standing in a herd with their ears flapping. You could really, these shape keys are a really easy way to bring some life. For the birds, I just used a lot of proportional editing and boxes and cubes and made this horrifying creature that is the thing of your nightmares. But it works as a bird from a far distance away. I gave it a really bad bird material that I created, which is a simple noise texture and a bump map. So nothing fancy there, but it was good enough for it to catch the light of the sun and get a little interesting look from a very far distance. Emphasis on distance. I did create a couple of shape keys, one with the wings up and then of course one with the wings down. Yeah, I'm real original. And that was just so I could quickly add some variation to the birds so they don't just look like stupid flat fake CG blobs in the air, but they actually look like something that has wings. So once I had that done, I just saved that out to a special saved place. I appended my bird model to my scene and then threw them into a collection called birds. And then utilizing those shape keys, I was able to give some nice wing variation to them, make it look like a little flock of birds here. The position of the birds in the scene was somewhat strategic. I wanted them to, even though it's a subtle thing, I wanted them to help draw the viewer's eye so that the viewer kind of looks left to right in the overall image. For compositional purposes, I was trying to keep in mind both the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. You should never feel bound to using a guide like this, but it does help with creating a really good starting point for an interesting image. For the lighting, I knew I was going to add a great big sphere to the very back of my scene for the sun. Looking at the lighting setup here, before I did all that though, if we just go to rendered mode, I wanted everything to start as a completely dark screen. So my HDR was turned completely down to 0. And then you can see I labeled all my area lights of what they are here. So if we just start enabling some of these, you can kind of get an idea of my lighting process, which was very simple. I initially had this strong backlight hitting the elephants, which was a very warm light to create that nice sharp rim around them. I actually had 2 of those for the elephants in the background as well. I hit them in the front with a nice big blue bounce light, and that would sort of help fill in the detail and bring back some of the local color of the elephants themselves so that their skin texture didn't get completely lost in the silhouette. I did a very similar thing for the tree. I wanted the tree to be really what popped, so I hit it with a sharp magenta backlight to get that nice sharp lighting crease, and then more of a sort of greenish cool bounce light in the front so that you bring back some of the detail. And then I had a pretty big area light on top, bouncing some soft blue light just to get some of the sky texture back in there onto the tree. I love working with area lights. There's a lot of flexibility and you can get really good realistic results really quickly. So Blender's area lights really awesome. And if you don't normally light with area lights, I'd encourage you to do that. I also threw in a big sunlight in the very back of my scene. This was purely for shadow direction, so that it would kind of trump all the other shadows and you could easily read where the sun was in the scene, because it was important that the sun was directly behind everything. I also used the sunlight to throw in a lot of warmth and general brightness to the scene, but you can see the sharp highlights it got on my background hills, and that was really effective. So once all of that was done, then I was able to kind of go back and turn on my HDR, which I got from HDR Haven, which is an awesome site for free HDRs. Go and check that out if you haven't. And the HDR was definitely meant to just sort of plus the light of the scene. I did render with transparent, but if we want to view the HDR, we can come down here to the camera settings and uncheck transparent so that we can actually see the image. So I just rotated it around to where this nice sunset worked in favor with my composition, where it was behind the elephants. And that worked great with the actual sun model that I added to the scene, which I threw on a completely separate render layer. And it's just this sphere with an emissive material set pretty high and just kind of a warm light. I set it in the same general area as my sun lamp. On the sun render layer, I just had everything else set to indirect only, so that the sun would be the only thing that renders on that render layer. And then on my main scene, I had the sun set to indirect only and everything else rendered as normal. And the reason I did this was I still wanted the bounce light of the sun to render on my main setup file, but I wanted to make sure I had a nice clean render layer without it so that I could just easily A over B and comp put them together and do some effects on my actual sun, because it was just a simple sphere. Then it was time to get it ready for rendering. I mentioned I enabled my mist pass. I did use the denoiser in Blender, and then I did enable a few other things like the environment, shadow, ambient occlusion. Even though I didn't end up using some of these, it's just really important and handy that you can have those passes, and when in doubt, just enable the passes. Cryptomat is also something that I didn't use for this particular render, but I just always enable it out of habit because it's so dang useful and just super awesome that Blender has Cryptomat. I'm still just so excited about that. So jumping into the compositor, this was the render I got right out of the gates, which is pretty good. I was really happy with it. There were a few tweaks I wanted to make, like the depth of field that I set and the initial render wasn't quite as steep as it needed to be. I know I wanted to add more depth of field and then just do a few minor adjustments to the image as well. This is my final node setup. It might look like a lot, but there's really not too much going on here. The first thing I did was use this ellipse mask to brighten up my focal point. So if I hit M on that node, you can see the before and after, what it did there. That just was to add even more warmth and draw your eye even further. It's sort of like doing a reverse vignette. That then went into an alpha over where I just A over B'd the render with my sun render layer. This was obviously just a clean emissive sphere. I used a displace node with a cloud texture as the vector and displaced it a bit, and then blurred it slightly to get that nice heat distortion look. That worked out really well, and then alpha overed my render, both render layers together to get that. I then mixed in my background environment, did a little bit of color adjustment, and used a simple alpha over to bring back my environment. Again, I rendered the whole thing on a transparent layer on purpose so that I could have more control over these sort of things. But it's important to make sure if you're doing that you check environment in your render passes so that your HDR does show up in the compositor. I then wanted to utilize my mist pass here. So I took that into a screen node and just screened it over top of my render to get that nice misty mountain effect on my render. You can see if we disable it, the before and after, and it really adds a lot of focus to your image. I do lose a lot of detail in the sky, it gets blown out, but I'm not too worried about that because I know that I could bring that back later in comp. I did do some defocusing, and for the Z pass, I used that same mist pass so that the background hills got defocused the exact same way that the mist was added. I also created just a simple mask for this front lower third of the image and used that as the factor of this bilateral blur node, which blurred the front of my image a good bit to bring back more of the depth of field that I wanted. I used a sunbeams node, which Blender has, which is pretty cool. It just takes any emissive light source and gives kind of this nice God rays effect. And I just added that, a little bit to taste. That brought back some nice haziness and some of that sunlight spreading throughout the scene. I took that into just a little bit of post-processing, did some color balance, and a couple of glare nodes, one for a fog glow and one for streaks, just to add a few little streaks to the sun itself. And then I did do some lens distortion just to give the ever so slightest amount of chromatic aberration, and also just a little bit of lens barreling in there. It's very, very subtle, but enough that it helps it feel more like a real image, hopefully. So once that was all done, this was my final output from the compositor. I don't like doing too much post-processing in the compositor, so this was a fair amount for me where I could feel like I was utilizing Blender's compositor in a good way, but also staying true to the render that I set up in the 3D scene. So that was it. Those were the steps I took in the compositor and in the 3D space to put that whole image together. And hopefully you can see it was definitely more of a minimalistic approach to an environment render, but still ended up with a result that I was really happy with and something that would look good in a demo reel or a portfolio. So you guys ought to try it, see what you can do with as few amount of assets as possible. And I think you'd be surprised at what you can come up with and create. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.